Let's focus on controllers in this episode. Ideally, I'd love to have a controllers, and maybe for the home and about and contact, those are usually static pages, which means there's nothing overly dynamic going on there. They just display static information. So maybe I could have a pages controller, and this would actually be a dedicated class. Now, generally, a controller is responsible for receiving a request, delegating in some form, and then returning a response. So in our case, if we had a home page, well, that will receive the request, and that could be data from a form request or anything like that. So receive the request, delegate, so maybe that asks the database for a handful of records, and then finally return a response. This is generally the domain for a controller. Now, if we have a home page, it'd be nice to have the About page within here, and then also the Contact page. Let's see what would happen. Here's our home page. So we would grab all of this and then delete it. Now, I could store it here, like so. For the About page, same thing. Delete that. And then finally, the Contact page, exact same thing again. And we'll delete that. Okay, how can we make this work? Well, first, we created a new file, so let's do composer dump autoload so that it will once again show up within the class map. Okay, but next, I already know this isn't going to work. Yep, can't find the file. Okay, well, the first step, of course, is to visit our routes file and update this. I no longer am loading this file. I'm going to load controllers / and pages controller, but it looks like I also need some way to specify which method to call. So we're going to use a convention like this. And you'll find that this is very similar to Laravel, which I'm going to show you in the very last episode of this series. And then I'll send you on to a new series to continue your learning. So that's fine, but you know what? All of my controllers are stored within this folder. So maybe I could remove that entirely and make it implicit. Okay, so that means About would go to Pages Controller at About. Culture, we didn't do that. Let's get rid of that. And then we had a Contact page, right? And that would be Pages Controller at Contact. We'll worry about these for this episode. Okay, well, how are we going to do this? Let's go through the entry point again. We load the routes file, and then we direct the request. So if we go into our router, down to the direct method, here we go. So let me show you what we're dealing with here. URI and the request type. Back to Chrome, give it a refresh. Our URI is currently nothing because it's the home page, and the request type is GET. So you'll remember that we have something like this. Do we have a route URI registered for a GET request? If so, all we're doing is just returning the value associated with that. So if we were to die, spit that out, now we're getting a string like that. So it sounds like instead of just returning that, what we really want to do is parse it, new up the controller, and then call the method. And we're going to do this all dynamically. So once again, before we write code, let's just kind of write it out the way we would want it to work. So if array key exists, I probably want to call the controller action and then return that. Okay, so let's create that method. It can be protected since nobody outside of this class will need to call it. It's just for our purposes. Now, for call action to work, what will that need? Well, it probably needs to know what is the controller and then what is the action or the method that we're going to trigger. Then, ultimately, it can do something like this. It news up the controller, and then it calls the action. But once again, we could be in a situation where the controller does not have a method. So for example, what if we sent this to gibberish? Well, back in our router, we would try to call that gibberish method, and it would throw an error. So why don't we do a quick check for that once again? We could say, if not method exists, and we give it the controller, and then the action. So if the controller does not have a method called home or about or contact, yeah, something's wrong. So let's just send it up the chain and throw an exception. And we might say something like controller does not respond to the action. Okay, so we kind of know how that's going to work. All we have to do now is give it the controller and the action name. Okay, well, let's think about this. Right now, we have a string. So I want to split this apart. In PHP, we can use a function called explode. So you give it the item that will explode them into pieces. So what is the separator? The @ symbol. And then we'll give it the routes, the get request type in this case, and then the URI. So if that's confusing at all, let me show you really quick. Let's say PHP interactive. And we'll say explode, and then we'll say pages controller at home. Or I'm sorry, of course, we need to, I'm used to a different tool here. We're going to var dump that. And sure enough, you can see how that works. So it separates these, and each one will become their own item of an array. That's exactly what we want. But at this point, we have an array, but call action wants to accept 2 arguments here, not an array. So here's what we could do. Let's pass this. We could, of course, save that to a variable, but I think this is fine. And then we're going to use the splat operator, which is a pretty cool feature. If you have an array, and then you pass that to a function using the splat operator, each of the items within that array will be converted into function arguments. So now, if I were to say die var dump controller in the action, you'll see how this works. Back to Chrome, give it a refresh, and there you go. So a couple of new things there. If you need to go over this again, definitely do so. Explode turns a string into items of an array. So it's just a way to split up a string. But then we want to turn that array into arguments to this function, so we can use the splat operator. And that is unique to PHP 5.6, by the way. So make sure that you can do that. And in this case, I have 7, so we're all good. So at this point, I think we might be all set. Let's try this out. We'll say die home, come back to Chrome, give it a refresh, and sure enough, we triggered the controller. So if I get rid of that, refresh, it works. But now, what about all this stuff down here? Require. Well, that's only because, if we go back to index, we no longer have to require anything. We're newing up a controller. So I can remove that entirely. Refresh, and there we go. So let's see what routes we have registered. We have about and contact. About works, and contact works, or I thought it did. No route defined for this URI. Let's come back. Ah, that was a post request. Let's bring it back to the get request, and now that one should work too. Okay, very cool. So once again, we had to do just a little bit of work here to make this possible. But remember, once you upgrade to a dedicated framework, they're going to do all this work for you, and it's going to be better than you'll think up on your own. So I'm showing you kind of a light way to do this on your own, but I don't actually intend for you to do this in real life. I just want you to understand the basic idea of how it works, and then after that, you're going to let other people be responsible for the plumbing and the wiring and all that junk. Oh, and by the way, this isn't quite right. I just saw a mistake I made. Right now, we're checking to see if a string has a method string. We actually need to new up the controller. So let's new up the controller here, then check to see if it has the action, and then finally call the action. Like so. Anyways, let's next switch over to our routes file. I'd like to do 2 things. In our pages controller, you'll see that each method looks very similar, where we require and then look in the views directory. Maybe I could just say, return a view called index. And then maybe even further, the extension is always .view.php, so maybe I could remove that. Then this would be return view about, and this would be return view contact. A little bit cleaner, right? Let's see if we can make that work. If I give it a refresh, it's not going to work because a view function doesn't exist. Okay, let's go back to Sublime. Why don't we store this within our Bootstrap file? Now, if we have more helper functions like this, we could create a dedicated file called helpers and then autoload that. But we don't need to worry about that until we have a handful. In this case, I only have one. Function view, it's going to accept the name of the view, And then we are going to return a require to views / the name.view.php. Okay, makes sense. So we're just assuming a convention here. All of your views will be placed within this directory, so we will assume that's what you want. If I come back and refresh, that all works like it did before, but we do see a new problem here, undefined variable users. Okay, well, if we come up, we loaded the view, but the view doesn't know about this users variable. So I want to pass it. And I'm going to do something like this, where I say users is users, or there's a little handy PHP function called compact, where you give it the name, and it's going to do the exact same thing. But like I said, it's equivalent to doing users. Either one works. Okay, but it's still not going to work. So if I give it a refresh, no, it's not working. Okay, well, that's because the view didn't accept a second argument. Let's allow that. Data. And then we're going to use a PHP function called extract. This is a cool one. So first, to prove to you that this works, we give it a refresh and everything works like it did before. So basically, extract is going to do kind of the opposite of compact. If our data is name is Joe, extract is going to create a variable called name and make it equal to that value. So if we had age is 25, and we call extract on the data, ultimately you're going to have a name variable and an age variable like this. And now when you require this file, your view will have access to those two variables. That's how this works. So for example, in our pages controller, maybe our company name is Laricas, obviously, and then we'll pass that through. Now, our about view will have access to it. Come back, about, and there we go. That's how we send data to our view. So now, let's just make sure that the homepage worked, where we had this little example of adding a user. So right now, the form is going to post to /names. But you know what? This is the homepage. Maybe what we're really doing is we want a URI to display all users, and then a endpoint to add a user. So let's do this. We're going to comment all of this out, and I'm just going to say homepage for now. Okay, so we give it a refresh, and we have our homepage. Next, I'm going to add some routes here. And we'll say router, when you get /users, I'm going to create a new users controller here, and I'm going to use a convention called index. Index will be responsible for displaying or rendering all of our users. Okay, controllers, users controller. We'll create that. And then we have a method called index. So we're going to load a view here called users, which means we need to create that, views, users.view.php. We can grab some of this. But now I can uncomment all of that. All users. Okay, but it's still not going to work, right? We come back, we visit users, and we get users controller does not respond to the index action. Once again, we created a new file, so we have to do a composer dump autoload. Like I told you, once you learn about PSR4 and that autoloading standard, you will not have to do this. But for class map, you do. Okay, we give it a refresh, but nope, still not working. First, we can see that we're missing an argument 2 for the view function. So right here, it's assuming that you will always give us data. But that's not the case. Sometimes you want to load a view and it doesn't require any data. So let's default to an empty array there. And that should get rid of that warning. Next, though, we didn't pass users for this page. We only did that for the home page. So we can grab this, return it to what we had before, and now our users controller can be responsible for that. And I'm going to use compact this time. Okay, refresh. And now users is responsible for this. Next, though, this isn't going to work yet, right? Okay, let's see what we need to do. Users will post to /names. No, let's post to /users now. Register an endpoint. When you post to users, we're going to call a users controller. And once again, a common convention is to call it store. Store a new user. Okay, users controller. store. And what do we have to do? We have to insert the user associated with the request, and then redirect back to all users. Those are the 2 steps. Okay, well, we already created this earlier. So you know what? We could grab this, delete it, get rid of the about culture. We don't care about that either. And let's paste that in, like so. But the location will now be users. Okay, looks good. So back to Chrome, head back, add a new name, submit, and there we go. It all works. So just like we did with Vue, maybe we could do a little redirect function here, where we do something like this. And for now, there's lots of ways to redirect, but maybe we'll just wrap up that header function call. Let's go back to Bootstrap. Second function, redirect. You want to be a little careful about global functions. A small smattering of them is incredibly useful, but if everything is a global function, it's not good. So keep it very minimal if you can. You don't want too much clashing there. Anyways, we'll say redirect to the path. And like I said, we're just going to do something like this. Let's change my quotes here, and then we'll say path. And that's fine. We're not too worried about this. So come back, give it a refresh, Jane, submit, and now that works. But yeah, our controller is starting to look fairly clean. And you know what? If you have any experience with Laravel whatsoever, this might be a little familiar to you. And I'm doing that on purpose, so that when you do switch over to something like Laravel, you're not going to be overwhelmed by all of these new things. What you will do is you'll see, oh, okay, I know controllers. I know how to load a view. I know how to fetch things from the database. And then when you look within your routes file, this is all going to be very familiar. And when you look in your views file, barring a few differences like the belay templating engine, it's all still going to feel somewhat familiar to you. So good job. If you're new to PHP, we're actually moving at a very fast pace compared to just about any other PHP series you could watch. They take it a bit slower. I've been pushing you pretty hard to some higher level concepts. So I hope you're getting a lot out of this. I expect it to be tough, and it should be tough. Stick with it, and all of this is going to make sense before you know it.